Welcome to Detrimental Keys to Success. I thought we could take today to dig in to this concept, a Hellenistic concept, really. What is a detrimental planet? What does it mean for a planet to be in its detriment? And kind of unpack it a little bit, since I notice we might get a little scared of this concept. Oh gosh, if a planet's in detriment, it might be kind of bad or scary. And it's not to say there aren't challenges that go along with a planet in detriment, but I like to think there's some like hidden powers and real benefits and strengths often to having a planet in detriment. So I'm going to kind of explore this topic a little bit today. And I think it might be the perfect time to explore it as well, because right now, as we speak, we do have the sun in detriment, and that is the sun in Aquarius. So kind of have a good vibe set up for this topic. So before we define detriment, I just wanted to maybe go over a little bit of a brief timeline of the concept itself. And when it comes to this presentation, I will say I am taking a little bit for granted that most of you are at least somewhat familiar with the way Hellenistic astrologers categorized planetary condition into domicile, exaltation, depression, and detriment. If you're unfamiliar with this way of categorization, it's really a way of assessing planetary condition. Maybe the TLDR is simply domicile and exaltation was a fancy way of saying for the ancient astrologers, they were saying, all right, this planet is being hosted by a sign that it likes, gets along with this sign. It can do what it wants in this sign. Versus fall and detriment. Now the planet is in a sign where it's maybe a little bit more uncomfortable, further away from the resources that it needs to complete the tasks that it wants to complete, and just maybe a little bit crabby. So that's kind of a very simplistic way to look at the categorization of domicile, exaltation, depression, and detriment. Now, according to Chris Brennan, during the early Hellenistic era, we don't actually see much on the concept of detriment, which again, we'll define in just a second. The early Hellenistic astrologers talked about domicile, exaltation, and fall quite a lot. We don't exactly know why they left out detriment. It could be one of those things from the early Hellenistic era that gets lost in translation or just simply lost. It isn't until maybe more the later Hellenistic era, Rhetorius starts to discuss this concept of detriment in his own way. He introduces a term, I'll try my best to pronounce this, enantioma, which actually meant opposition. Now, he doesn't mean opposition in the way that we might say the sun is opposing Saturn. He meant it actually in a way to describe a planet that was opposite its sign that it rules. Dorotheus also notably mentions a term, kakunonte, which also translates to something along the lines of corrupted. And this is also his way of describing a planet who is opposite to the sign it rules. It's not really until this medieval Renaissance era where we really start to hear more about detriment. It gets a little bit more ironed out. So just keep that in the back of your mind as we go forth, and let's really dig in. What is a planet in detriment? Let's define it. So this is simply a planet placed opposite to its domicile. And thus the planet is now ruled by a different planet that has different goals and agendas. Let's unpack this with an example. Let's take Venus in Libra. Venus is in her domicile in Libra, meaning Venus is at ease in Libra. She rules Libra. So when she's in Libra, she's in her own house. She has access to all of her resources, the things that she likes, and she can execute her goals very easily. And what are Venus's goals? Well, she wants to harmonize. She wants to throw a good party. Maybe she wants to socialize a little bit and just make people comfortable. Now, let's take the sign opposite to Libra, which is Aries. Venus in Aries is Venus in detriment. Again, Venus is opposite her house, right? And what does she do in Aries? That's kind of the question of this talk. And in Aries, Venus must answer to Mars now. In Libra, she's in charge. She's in charge of her own world. She's in charge of who exits and enters her house. In Aries, now she has to kind of go to Mars and ask for what she wants and needs. And that can give a very different flavor to Venus, okay? And this is true for any planet in detriment. We're talking about any planet now going to the sign opposite that it rules and having to live in a house that isn't exactly theirs. Okay. So let's visualize this. So what's going on in Venus's house? Maybe you can close your eyes, think about what's going on in there. Maybe there's like a really comfortable couch. It smells kind of nice. She's probably cooking some nice snacks. There's some nice socialization going on. It's generally a pleasant environment. Okay. Now, what happens when Venus is in Aries? Again, now she has to go be hosted by Mars. Mars's house looks a lot different. Now we're looking at a Colosseum-like place. Venus shows up at Mars's house. This place is kind of a disaster. There's like blood stains on the carpet, and instead of a couch in the living room, there's a boxing ring, and it doesn't smell that great. And she wanted to make cookies, but all there is in the fridge is raw meat. So she can't quite do what she wants to do. She has to figure out, how do I harmonize and socialize and make things beautiful in this environment that is less than ideal. Okay. So this language I'm using, this sort of idea that a planet can be in a environment that it doesn't necessarily vibe with, it actually has ancient roots. And I love what Demetra George says about this concept, kind of showing up in the ancient world. So let's put our shoes in the ancient world for a second while I read this quote from Ancient Astrology in Theory and Practice. Demetra says, one of the worst punishments in the ancient world was being banished from one's country into a land where the person did not know anyone, could not understand the language, did not have the rights of citizens, and did not have access to any physical or financial support from family, friends, or the government. Imagine the desperate actions of someone who had been exiled from their homeland and is bereft of resources and support. Okay, so let's take this in. I mean, she's absolutely right. In the ancient world, if you were sent to someone else's territory, it's not like 2026. You don't have the resources that we have today. I am currently in Italy staying with my cousin. I don't really speak Italian, but I know if I walked outside, I could like Google Translate something or Google Map something if I really got lost. I have the resource of the internet or even my cousin. But think about being in this position in ancient times, not knowing the language, not having the currency, not having connections could be a complete disaster. And the ancient world also tended to be more fatalistic. If you were exiled to a place, it's kind of your fate. And I'm interested in how we can apply this concept to our current world today. Again, once we get more into the late Hellenistic medieval era, we see the astrologers talking a lot more about detriment and using words that basically translate to exile, adversity, debility, obstacle, and hindrance. So I'm interested, how do we take these words like exile and bring them into our current world? It's not to say people aren't exiled in this current world. However, I do think we live in a world that perhaps is, I like to think, a little less fatalistic than the ancient world, where if you were exiled, you're kind of shit out of luck. But, I like to think that we maybe live in a slightly more accessible reality. Okay. So my version of detriment, it's not me rewriting this ancient philosophy, but think about this. What if a planet in detriment was kind of evoking more of a black sheep archetype? What I mean by that is a black sheep is someone who might feel different or othered, or like they are misunderstood, or have really great ideas that are maybe even beyond their time, right? And then they feel like, ooh, I'm just kind of othered because of my ideas. I think that could be a common feeling for those of us who might have planets in detriment. I also think planets in detriment have to figure out a way to think outside the box. Remember, let's go back to Venus. She had to go to the Colosseum to Mars's house. So she now has to think outside the box. How do I create harmony here when there's a boxing ring in the living room, right? She's going to have to think completely differently, maybe meditate, get some new ideas. I have faith by the end of the night, she'll have everybody, sitting in a circle sharing their feelings, but, she has to think about how she's going to do that first. I also think a planet in detriment in someone's chart, it implies a non-ideal circumstance, a challenging circumstance that later perhaps acts as a point of initiation. Let's say someone has a planet in their chart in detriment and leaves their home quite young because their home is not a safe environment. But then they use this leaving of home as a jumping off point, as a jumping off point into the beginning of their story. That would be an example of how a planet in detriment can work. I also think people with planets in detriment tend to be really good at fighting for the underdog, beginning revolutions. I kind of call them the shit stirrers, like they're like, all right, something's up, something is unjust, something is not right, and I'm going to be the one to say it, which I actually think we really need planets in detriment, people with planets in detriment, especially in the world that we live in. Okay. So here's the official list. We've got Sun in Aquarius, Moon in Capricorn, Mercury in Sag/Pisces, Venus in Aries and Scorpio, Mars in Taurus and Libra, Jupiter in Gemini and Virgo, and Saturn in Cancer and Leo. We're going to get through hopefully about half of these. We won't touch on every single planet in detriment, but my goal of today's talk is to give you an idea of how to start to interpret your own planets in detriment. If you don't have planets in detriment, but maybe you work with clients who do, I would say if you want to be an astrologer, you're bound at some point to run into a client with a planet in detriment. So I hope this can help give some ideas to maybe how to counsel people in a trauma-informed way, right? Okay. It's also worth mentioning when it comes to Hellenistic interpretation, this is only one piece of the puzzle. The Hellenistic astrologers had many layers of how they were assessing planetary condition. They were asking, is this a day chart or a night chart? And if it's a day chart, now I have a team of planets that maybe operate a little bit better. And then if it's a night chart, I have different planets that operate better at night. There's the benefics, which are the planets like Venus and Jupiter, who usually can manifest good things, whereas the malefic planets might manifest some quote unquote bad things, right? So there's a ton of layers. This doesn't even touch the surface, but we're gonna do our best with unpacking this concept in the more simple terms. Okay, so let's take in this image here, and I'm just reading some of the comments here. Yeah, cool. So let's talk about the sun in its own house, right? We have Helios. I have him pictured at the top of a mountain. His house is kind of shaped like a stage. He's at a place where the sun shines 24 hours a day. That's how it works in his house. It's light all the time, and that's the way he likes it. But let's imagine the sun now having to go to the house of Saturn. Now, this notion of everlasting light being at the center is just a little bit more out of reach, right? In the house of Saturn, specifically Aquarius, we're getting more of like a cave vibe where sun and the light isn't as accessible. And Helios still has to figure out, though, how do I manifest what I want to manifest, my goals, my ambitions in this cave? I could so easily do it in Leo at the top of this mountain. Now I got to figure something out in this Aquarian cave. Two images, two kind of weird juxtaposing images that I think evoke for me sun in Aquarius. I have the sad lamp here, or the seasonal affective disorder lamp, maybe around Capricorn and Aquarius season. The Capricorn seasons, at least in the northern hemisphere, when we lose our light, we get kind of depressed. We have to figure out how to make that artificial light in order to help regulate our nervous system even. So maybe the sun in Aquarius has to kind of carry a sad lamp into his cave. I also have this picture, or this painting by Caravaggio. It's Saint Jerome writing. Now, I love this. I feel like it evokes some sort of sun in detriment energy, because we have Saint Jerome as the sun, the solar being, Caravaggio was famous for making paintings that used light to focus in on the main being in the painting. So he's kind of being presented as this solar being. What is he doing? Well, he's translating the Old Testament into Latin. He's very purposeful. He's on his path, doing like those sun things, those unique things that you can only do. But yet Saturn, the skull, looms in the background to remind him life is not is not everlasting, right? Or is it? Because if the sun is infinite life, Saturn is the eminence of death. So this is kind of what the sun has to deal with in Aquarius. I made my own little phrases or images that I wanted to associate with each planet in Detriment. The image that I made up for Sun in Aquarius is masked bandit who steals to feed the hungry. I thought the mask was a particularly important symbol to include with Sun in Aquarius, just because the sun fundamentally wants to express some sort of unique path of individuality, wants to illuminate, wants to be at the center, right? But with the mask, he has to figure out a different way to do that. And in Detriment, oftentimes Sun in Aquarius natives have a challenge with individual expression. Maybe there's more of a tendency to identify with the group, right? Individuals might have to figure out how to express themselves in an environment where they're seen as different. Sometimes, not all the time, Sun in Aquarius people can be targeted for individual expression. We'll see that in our chart example in a moment. But I also think there's this deep gift to bringing to light what perhaps society wants to keep in the dark, right? That might be the hidden key of having the sun in Detriment. I also was thinking, when is it necessary to bring darkness to the light? I don't know, even on a level of being an energetically sensitive person, like when I think about sitting in the light all day, that feels so overstimulating. Like I need a moment in the dark to reset myself. I feel like there's some bigger symbolism behind those moments in human life where we might need that darkness to reset, which might be the sun in Detriment's job. Yeah, so let's take our sun in Detriment example, Bob Marley, who had the sun in Aquarius. Obviously, he also has a few other things in Detriment. He happens to have, I think, four planets in Detriment. So this is a good example, of course, that like just because you have many things in Detriment, it becomes a big part of your story, but it doesn't necessarily mean you are unlikable, unlovable, doomed, don't reach any sort of success. We'll actually see this in all of our examples, okay? So Bob Marley was obviously famous for his music, which he made during a great time of political unrest in his homeland of Jamaica, where there were two rival political parties and then gang violence to go along with a lot of the tumultuous political situations that he was living through. And I think just this idea that he was born into an environment where things were tumultuous, not only politically, but in his family life as well, kind of speaks to what we talked about earlier with the detriment person being in an uncomfortable environment, right? And having to figure out how they can thrive in an environment that doesn't necessarily set them up for the most ease, right? So he starts getting really popular for his reggae music. And even like rival groups and the rival gangs of Jamaica, they all kind of united because they liked him, right? So that's kind of the black sheep archetype there. He's doing something different than everybody else and being noticed for it. Now, this does cost him at one point in his life, specifically December 1976. There's an assassination attempt made. He's nearly shot, or I think he is shot partially in his own home. Again, let's go back to that ancient way of thinking. The detrimental planet is exiled from the home and has to deal with those conditions, those uncomfortable conditions in exile. This might also imply that when the native is at home, literally, that home is uncomfortable, dangerous, or just, has some challenges, right? So for him to be almost killed in his own home, for me, kind of speaks to maybe a darker manifestation of the sun in detriment. Now, after this point, he goes to London. That's when that was right after the assassination attempt. And then he turns 32 in London as an exile. I won't go into the timing technique too much, but those of you who are familiar with annual perfections know that 32 is associated with a ninth house year. So when he's in exile in London, he's in a ninth house year. His ninth house is in Leo, ruled by who? The sun in exile, right? And he is in exile, trying to escape the political situation of his own country, or I guess not trying to escape, but for his own safety, he must go away. But this leads to the release of this epic album that we still listen to today. All of us know the words to. I think the lyrics, some of the lyrics from Exodus also invoke this kind of sun in detriment vibe. No bullets can stop us now. We neither beg nor will we bow. Okay. There's like the rabble rouser vibe that a detrimental planet can give. In this great future, you can't forget your past. Do you hear Saturn? The ruler of the past. And then one love, let's get together and feel all right. That for me kind of speaks to maybe the identification with the group that Bob Marley experienced. Okay. All right. For time's sake, let's move on to the moon in Capricorn. I have the moon's house set up as a greenhouse because, when the moon is in Cancer, maybe an Aristotelian way of looking at that would be, okay, the moon is like warm and moist because those are the qualities that are needed for growth, right? So when the moon is in Cancer, it's kind of like being in this warm greenhouse. There's lush abundance everywhere you look. What happens though when the moon has to go to Saturn's house? Well, now the moon is in the opposite of lush abundance. Now the moon's kind of in this igloo-like apartment. And the moon has to figure out, how do I grow and do what I need to do in this igloo, essentially? Okay. My term for the moon in Capricorn is the negligent nurturer or the nurturer of negligence. Now, of course, this isn't meant to offend any moon in Capricorns in the room. In fact, I think moon in Capricorn can often run into maybe these characters outside of themselves, even. I think a lot of moon in Capricorns might report parents who may have been neglectful in one way or another. I also think moon and Capricorn people in general can be very attuned nurturers themselves to everybody but themselves, right? Tale as old as time. The moon fundamentally wants to read the room. You know, they want to adjust to the environment, give intuitive responses, express, emote, and change. Think about how fast the moon moves. Every 2.5 days, the moon is going to move into a new sign. That's because the moon fundamentally represents how our environment is always changing. So when the moon is in detriment, like I mentioned, maybe there's a little bit of a challenge with receiving the nurturing one needs to change, express, grow. You know, that environment just isn't as abundant. Yet the native has to figure out how to grow in this kind of icy environment. We actually see this in nature. There are many different plants that can grow in rather barren environments. Here I have the example of the cactus, who can gather its limited resources and then of water and store it for when it really needs that water. You could probably name a few other plants that maybe do the same thing, can grow in these very not necessarily nutritional environments. Okay, so we really do see this in nature. Okay, my moon in Capricorn person is Anthony Bourdain. And he was a writer, TV personality, and chef. Isn't it interesting that the moon in Capricorn, although it struggles maybe with the theme of receiving the nurturing that it needs, Anthony Bourdain finds himself fundamentally involved with like the seedling of nurturing for us, which is food, right? And he says in a 2014 Medium article, he says, there is, of course, nothing more political than food. Food itself, who's got it, who doesn't, what's cooking is usually the end of a long, often violent story. Okay. Leave it to a moon in Capricorn to use the word food, politics, and violence in the same paragraph, right? Because to them, on some level, receiving nutrients and getting what they need might be associated with things like politics and violence, or just in general more Saturnian things like limitations. Okay. He also, though, he does something special with his moon in Capricorn, because in his focus on food, he shows the world so many new cultures, and he also teaches us about the trauma of the culture through the food. And he's just such a great person to learn history from, in a way. And history is kind of a lunar theme, right? Keeping track of what has happened. So, you know, I think he changes our perspective on food as much as he might have struggled with nurturing himself. in a different article from The Guardian, he says, I'm proud that in the last few years as a professional chef, however upset I was with the staff, we'd still be able to have a beer together at the end of the night without ill will. I put aside my psychotic rage after many years of being awful to line cooks, abusive to waiters, bullying dishwashers. It's terrible and counterproductive to make people feel idiots for working hard for you. He also says in that same article, I was an unhappy soul with a huge heroin and then crack problem. I hurt, disappointed, and offended many, many people, and I regret it a lot. It's a shame I have to live with. Now, don't get me wrong, not all Moon and Capricorn people are going to carry these same qualities of the past and reflect on their past in the same way. I don't think Moon and Capricorn people are inherently cruel or whatnot. But I think what he's reflecting on is interesting, because he's saying, I was in an environment where we were literally cooking, making food, making nutrients for others, and I was making the environment a Saturnian one, one that was cold and not nurturing, the opposite of nurturing. And that kind of speaks to the Moon in Detriment for me. And maybe later in life is when he learns how food can be something that kind of cracks open his heart in a way. Yeah. It's a complicated chart too. Again, we can't just look at the Moon in Detriment here, but I think he's a good example of it regardless. Okay. Let's move on to Mercury. Mercury's house is very well organized in Gemini. It kind of looks like a library. And there's also a system. There's a way to find everything in Mercury's house. There's a lot of different subjects. There's a lot of different things to read. Yet there's a system, the Dewey Decimal System. You go into a library, you want to find a book, there's a way to find that exact thing that you're looking for. And that's how Mercury likes it. Mercury wants there to be an answer, right? Now think about this. Mercury, planet of communication and information, is now taking a trip to the house of Jupiter. And in this case, the house of Jupiter is this ever-changing island where nothing is consistent. Nothing is really categorized. At any point of, taking a turn on the island, there could be different cultures, different food, maybe slightly different weather, slightly different ways of dressing. And it's all to be experienced, and none of it is documented. So how is Mercury to function in this Jupiterian sign? Okay. So I'm calling Mercury in Sagittarius the documenter of miracles. So I'm thinking about, what does Mercury really do in Jupiter's house? Well, fundamentally, again, like we talked about with Mercury's library, Mercury kind of wants to communicate in a straightforward way. A plus B equals C, 1 plus 2 equals 3. But in Sagittarius, that's not, it's not the questions that Mercury is necessarily, it's not the answers that Mercury is looking for. I want us to think about a question we might ask our priest. I say that lightly. Maybe your priest is your astrologer or your best friend, but think about those types of questions, like that cannot be answered like a math problem. What is my purpose? What is the meaning of life? What do I do when I'm lost? Why is this happening? those questions are so hard to answer, right? And that evokes Mercury in detriment. I have here the mascot, my unofficial mascot for Mercury in Sagittarius is the Cheshire cat. If you're familiar with Alice in Wonderland, this is kind of a fork in the road that Alice reaches, and she asks the Cheshire cat which way she should go, and he will not give her a straight answer. So that's kind of how Mercury and Sagittarius might respond, right? You want a simple answer, and nothing's quite simple. Or as simple as you want it to be, because the Mercury and Sagittarius might see things for what is unseen beneath, right? Okay. So our person for Mercury in Sagittarius is C.S. Lewis. Now, most of us know him for his series, The Chronicles of Narnia. But I wanted to pull out a little something from his book, Miracles, because I think it's funny that a Mercury in Sagittarius would write about such a thing. I also just pulled this little biographical blurb from just astro charts. They label him as novelist, poet, academic, medievalist, literary critic, essayist, lay theologian, and Christian apologist. I just think it's funny because I think only a Sagittarius stellium could be labeled as such, like we didn't even need the chart to know that this person has some big Sagittarius placements. What I want to read to you just a little bit about this book, because even as I read the about section, I think I pulled this from Amazon. I was like, God, I really hear Mercury in detriment in this description. So bear with me, but I think you'll enjoy it, and try your best to open your ears to when Mercury creeps in to such a philosophical, theosophical subject like miracles. Do miracles really happen? Are miracles logically impossible? How do you prove that miracles exist? Everyone has an opinionated response, but if you're a skeptic, then no historical evidence is likely to convince you. In Miracles, C.S. Lewis challenges the rationalists and the cynics, Mercury, who are mirrored in their lack of imagination, and provides a poetic and joyous affirmation that miracles really do occur in everyday lives. He presents the idea that miracles are not compatible with nature, and thus introduces evidence of a supernatural world. Very Jupiterian, very Sagittarian. Lewis defines a miracle as an inference with nature by supernatural powers, and concludes they are not statistical anomalies because miracles do not, in fact, break the laws of nature. I mean, it's pretty cool to see a Mercury in detriment person basically take a stab at explaining such an unexplainable concept, right? And I think that's exactly what Mercury in detriment does. Again, Mercury is away from Gemini, where he's most comfortable. He can get all the answers he wants in Gemini. In Sagittarius, there's no clear answer. So he has to attempt to explain what is unexplainable. Okay. And that's pretty cool. I think if you have Mercury in Sagittarius or Pisces, like your way of explaining the unexplainable could be really powerful. Okay. Let's see. For time's sake, I do have, it's hard. I have one more Mercury example that I think is so, let's stick with Mercury, and then we're going to finish with Mars. Okay. One more Mercury example, just because I really like this example. Okay. Mercury in the house of Virgo, kind of similar to Gemini's house. We have like a very orderly house. Maybe it's filled with maybe slightly more evolved systems. And perhaps there's some element of the natural world within this house. Maybe it's made of all natural wood, and there's nothing synthetic. Why can't I say that word? Probably because I'm talking about Mercury and Detriment. Now Mercury's going to go visit, though, the house of Pisces. Oof. First of all, this house isn't even on solid ground. This house is more in the imagination. And this house has no sensical sort of organization. It's kind of like things pop up and then they disappear, and what you need kind of arises. It's a really interesting place where Mercury can never find the book he's looking for, but he will find a book that he's not looking for and then have to learn about that, right? So Mercury in Pisces, I call this planet in Detriment the translator of nonverbal language. Again, we have Mercury in Jupiter's house again. And I associate Pisces, it's the most intangible sign. There's a lot of maybe non-material things involved with Pisces, because Pisces is our shedding of our body, our meat suit, and we're going back to wherever we came from on a soul level, right? So how is Mercury supposed to translate this concept or speak in the Piscean Jupiterian language? Well, these languages are not, Spanish, English, French, Italian. These languages are all sort of intangible and nonverbal. Mercury in Pisces is very good at talking to animals, maybe even ghosts. I also have like reading body language, the handshake from the secret society, all these ways that we can communicate without words. One of my clients is Virgo rising, ruled by Mercury and Pisces, and she works as a special education teacher. And I think that's beautiful because oftentimes her job literally requires her to communicate and understand students who sometimes are not verbal. And I love that example. Now, Mr. Rogers, TV host, also ordained Presbyterian minister. That feels very Jupiterian. He's also a writer. Of course, he's best known for the TV show Mr. Rogers. He has one other planet in Detriment, Jupiter in Sagittarius. Maybe that's the ordained minister in him. I think it's interesting. He had a degree in musical composition, and I think we could think about music, especially music with no lyrics, as a way that we communicate in a nonverbal way. I mean, you can listen to a sad song with no lyrics and know it's sad, right? How do we do that? Well, we can do that because Mercury in Detriment exists. I also think it's interesting that he wrote so many songs for kids about kindness and being neighborly. And those concepts, kind of like miracles, aren't the easiest to understand. I also think it's interesting here that, yes, we know Mercury is going to be opposite his domicile, Virgo, right? But the fifth house is children, right? So who rules Mr. Rogers' fifth house of children? That would be his Mercury in Pisces. So maybe he has this gift of communicating with kids, right? In these ways, communicating these concepts that are hard to put into words. How to be kind, there's not really a class on that, but he attempts and succeeds at teaching that. He says there are 3 ways to ultimate success. The first way is to be kind. The second way is to be kind. And the third way is to be kind. Is this my 5-minute warning?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Perfect. Then he says, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say, look for helpers. You will always find people who are helping. Let's do one more. I think 5 minutes is going to be enough time just so we can get Mars in here. Mars in Detriment in Libra. What happens when Mars, who's doing so much better at the Colosseum with all of that meat in the fridge and the blood stains on the carpet, now he has to go figure out how to live in Venus's house, right? So I'm calling Mars in Libra the defender of innocence. Fundamentally, I think Mars carries a more selfish energy. And I don't mean selfish in like a bad connotative way. I mean, Mars wants what he wants. He wants to act on his desires and his desires alone. He doesn't really want to think about other people before he does it. He just wants to do it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But in Libra, the consideration of others becomes an actionable goal. I also think that Mars in Libra has a lot of roots in the pursuit of justice, specifically the pursuit of justice often being like a physical thing, like literally fighting for someone who is weaker or less physically able. Mars in Libra might be willing to disrupt the aesthetically pleasing environment in order to achieve more balance. And I also think Mars in Libra likes to make protest art. Okay. All right, our last example of the day is Colin Kaepernick. He's another one that has a lot of detrimental planets. Ooh. And he has not only Mars in Libra, but Venus in Scorpio and Saturn in Sagittarius. Colin Kaepernick is a professional football player and activist who becomes pretty widely known, especially in 2016, for protesting police brutality by taking a knee during the national anthem. Okay, so here's him kind of disrupting. I'm not sure if we would call the football field a Venusian place. I think the football field is much more of a Martian place because it's focused on like competition and brute force. Yet I would argue that the NFL is kind of more of a Venus place. You know, there's a lot of money involved with the NFL. There's a lot of like kind of commitment to aesthetics. So he's kind of disrupting something that is supposed to be fun and pleasurable and joyful. It's a game, right? It's entertainment. And he's taking a stand. He's saying, no, speak now, I must, right? So this is sort of a really profound moment during that period of time, and still is. And after he continues to kneel during the national anthem during the 2016 football season, he doesn't return to the NFL. There's a lot of speculation about why this may be. Some people think he was essentially like blacklisted from playing. Um, Again, that's only speculation, but kind of seems likely. And I bring this up because what did we learn about detrimental planets? They often result in the person being exiled. Okay. So he does the Mars and Libra thing, but yet he kind of gets punished for it later. And now standing up for what he believes, he's sort of unable to maybe continue to do what he loves, which is to play football. Yet things still work out for him with his partnership with Nike. And he's not completely exiled from his career. Okay. So those are just a few examples of planets in detriment. And I hope that gave you a good idea of maybe how to start unpacking planets in detriment in your own chart. Yeah, and I would love to talk questions or comments. Yeah.
Okay, so then thank you very much, Mallory. That was a fantastic presentation. And I absolutely know that everybody fully and completely enjoyed it who showed up. The comments were just incredible. The conversation was just off the charts. We do have some questions if you have a few moments.
Yeah.
So first, Renee Aland, if I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, says Mercury in Sagittarius, but with Placidus Scorpio 10th house next to the midheaven, would you look at the Sag sign or the Scorpio Placidus house? So I guess if someone has Mercury in Sag, are you looking at the Scorpio 10th house to determine the MC?
Oh, okay. It's so funny because I'm such a whole house user that sometimes I forget. Yeah, I would always go. I think the question is if can I see the question? Sorry, I think
It should be in the
or
Q&A if you can see that. Yeah, it's a little bit hard to delineate the question exactly.
yeah, I wonder who was that in the presentation who had that, or is that the person talking about their own chart? Um, but anyway, sorry, I can't quite grasp
So,
the question.
so when you're delineating charts and someone has, and you're using whole house system, and someone has an MC outside of the 10th house, how do you work with that?
Oh gosh. Okay. Got it. Got it. Thank you for repeating. I think I was still in Mercury and detriment land. So essentially when you're using whole house, yeah, the midheaven can end up in other houses besides the 10th house. And it simply just inputs some um 10th house significations into whatever house it's in. So let's say someone has their midheaven in the eighth house. Well, their career is going to have an eighth house tone. So, their career is a funeral home director or, your accountant, probably has the midheaven in the eighth house, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, and then if they had, say, Mercury and Sagittarius ruling the midheaven in the eighth house, they might have a very kind of like macabre funeral home or, something out of the ordinary, maybe. I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah.
A multicultural, multi-religious funeral home. Yeah, that is non-denominational. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, then we have Marie Claire, and Marie Claire asks, what happens when Mars is in detriment, but also conjunct the south node of the moon
Mhm.
and balsamic conjunct with Neptune? Well, this is a complex formula, and square the sun Uranus in the first house. Can you delineate
Yeah.
that?
Well, what I will say is, so we have Mars, who is a malefic. So a planet that tends to manifest it's slightly more negative or negative manifestations, right? And I will say the ancient astrologers didn't love the south node either. They they kind of felt the south node was a little bit malefic as well. So I would actually be thinking from maybe even a past life perspective, how was Mars and themes with Mars difficult in a past life? And how are maybe you meant in this lifetime to work with Mars in a new way that maybe your soul hasn't quite experienced? I mean, Sun Uranus in the first house kind of gives me exile, rebel vibes. And then if Mars is in detriment, we probably have the exile thing going on too. So could be maybe a karmic story about conflict and how to face conflict and be your last
Masterful.
archetype, you know?
Mm.
Yeah.
Masterful delineation. Thank you. One more question. Hassan Ghazel Bey asks, can Mallory speak to two planets in detriment yet in mutual reception?
Yeah, totally. And Hassan, I also saw your other comment about how Mr. Rogers had Mercury in detriment, but conjunct Venus exalted. So I think it's kind of it's same but different. But I think when two planets have mutual reception, in general, they're helping each other. So when two planets have mutual reception, like we just saw in Colin Kaepernick's chart, the Venus in Scorpio, Mars in Libra, they kind of have something going on, maybe not traditional mutual reception, but I think they're talking to each other. The detrimental, more challenging effects of a planet in detriment are going to be maybe eased and we kind of see that in Colin Kaepernick, the Colin Kaepernick example. Was he exiled from the NFL? Yeah. But did he earn the respect of as an activist from millions of people, inspire millions of people? Yes. Does he did he get $1 million contract from Nike? Yes. Okay, so it could have turned out worse for him. So I think that mutual reception is kind of helping mitigate some of those truly more challenging manifestations of the detrimental planet.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mallory. One final question. If you have a client who comes to you with a strong planet in detriment and they feel very challenged by their life, are you approaching them from the sense or a perspective of how can you accept your circumstances and work with them in the positive way? Or are you approaching them from like, here are the gifts, please move into these and emphasize them? What's your particular approach with the client themselves?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think, well, one thing I'll just say is when we have clients with planets in detriment, um, you couldn't sugarcoat it if you tried. Like there's just something about the nature of someone with something in detriment. They know when you're trying to like when you're trying to put a like shiny spin on it. They're like, no, like I think first and foremost, validating someone's experience is always
Mhm.
important. And it's okay to have a client who's having a challenging experience. So as the astrologer, maybe sometimes we feel pressure to, really make this into something, but it's also sometimes people just need us to validate a challenge. And I think our job as astrologers is also partially to inspire. So perhaps you see Jupiter about to light up that detrimental planet or that planet in detriment. Maybe you can tell your client that there's an opportunity to talk to this planet in detriment in a different way because it's being transited right now. just an example, but I would actually look more towards transits of that planet in detriment and look for maybe some opportunities there to potentially shift some energy around it. Yeah, as much as we can.
Deep, fantastic, great answer. Thank you. One other question came in from Isis, if you feel like you have a moment.
Yeah.
So Isis asks, how do you think being retrograde affects a planet that is already in detriment?
Um, and it depends. I'm a big past life person. Like I like to think we we come from many lives, and when I see a planet in retrograde, especially a personal planet that's also in detriment, it kind of has a similar feel to that earlier question about the planet in detriment conjunct a node. It feels like just a little bit of a siren, like, okay, we got to pay attention to this, especially in this lifetime, because maybe there were circumstances in the past lifetime that didn't let us really break free from whatever this pattern or thing or misfortune was. In this lifetime, it's retrograde or it's conjunct the node. Okay, there's maybe more of an opportunity to bring awareness to it. And if you're into using the progress chart, I might also look to see if that planet ever stations direct in this lifetime.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mallory, for coming on the Mercury Hour, sharing your wisdom and sharing your teachings with us. Really, absolutely appreciate it. It was just brilliant and fantastic. Thank you so much. And then everybody who's come, thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Thank you for meeting and developing your craft by coming to the Open Mercury Hour as you do every month. Absolutely hope to see you next week for Ryan Butler teaching on the soul for the OPA Australia presentation for the year ahead, and then at the Celeste Brooks Transit meeting. Thank you, everybody. Have a good day and be well and practice astrology with good heart.
Thanks, Georgia.